Lord, some councils are better placed than others to sustain such services. So I turn to the issue impacting rural communities. In 2015, the then DEFRA Secretary Liz Truss claimed, "This government is committed to ensuring the interests of rural communities and businesses are accounted for within our policies and programmes." 4 years after that claim, I chaired your Lordship's Special Committee on the Rural Economy, and that committee concluded that her commitment had not been met. Rural areas were losing out. We demonstrated that for many rural services, health, dentistry, public transport, policing, among others, government funding per head was lower for rural areas than for urban ones, despite higher delivery costs. For policing, for example, the current funding formula means that in Suffolk, where I live, we get a Home Office grant of £114 per residence, whereas Merseyside gets £217. And the committee also demonstrated that rural house prices and rents were higher despite lower wages, broadband and mobile connectivity was worse, and government funding to local rural councils was lower, meaning higher council taxes for rural dwellers. The evidence was clear then that rural areas were being unfairly treated, not least in the local government funding settlement. 5 years on, my lords, little has changed. All of these disparities remain. Of course, there have been some welcome initiatives. Delivering Rural Opportunity, published only on Monday, lists some of the government's favourites. But, my lords, despite such welcome initiatives, huge disparities remain between rural and urban areas. And in times of reducing public expenditure, it's ever more important to distribute available resources fairly. Now, on the 5th of March, Michael Gove, in the final local government finance settlement, appeared to suggest that he'd cracked it. And he said, "In response to the consultation feedback and in recognition of the specific challenges and difficulties local councils can face serving rural sparse populations, we're increasing the Rural Services Delivery Grant by £15 million for 2024-25. Of course, any increase is welcome. But as the Rural Services Network has pointed out, the extra money will only go to a limited number of rural councils, only to the top quartile of councils based on a super sparsity measure. Very many will get no extra funding. And even with this small extra cash for a few councils, huge rural-urban disparities will remain. And the RSN analysis for 24-25 shows just how stark it's going to be. Urban local authorities will receive some 36%, that's £141, more in government-funded spending power per head compared to rural authorities, and rural residents will pay on average 20%, that's £112, more per head in council tax than their urban counterparts, because rural councils are still getting less government grant. This simply isn't fair. Rural communities continue to be disadvantaged and their residents left behind at a time when the aim is supposed to be to level up across the country. 10 years ago, the government seemed to acknowledge the need to do something about it and change the funding formula to make it fairer. But in effect, they then didn't use it. They added and froze in place a damping process, and as a result, there are councils in London receiving millions of pounds more than the government's own formula says they should, and rural councils getting far less than they should. Of course, I want to see the size of the pot increased, but whatever its size, it should be allocated fairly. So does the noble lady, the Minister, accept that it isn't being, that rural communities are losing out, and that the damping process should be phased out? My lords, all councils are getting a poor deal from this government, and rural councils are getting the worst deal of all.
My lords, I too would like to thank the noble Lord Shipley for